All right, welcome everyone. This is the CRADLE Seminar Series. My name's Phil Dawson. I'm one of the co-directors of CRADLE, which is the Centre for Research and Assessment and Digital Learning here at Deakin University. If you're here for the TV show House of Cards, then I don't know what to tell you. You're in the wrong place. You're in the wrong time. I haven't heard anything about that show since 2018 and probably hadn't you either. But if you're here for a seminar titled A House of Cards, Equity Group Students' Experiences of Navigating University, then you are absolutely in the right place. Joe, could you please advance to the next slide? I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on unceded, stolen lands here in Australia. I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country here in inner southeast Melbourne, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and becoming, and really acknowledge the tens of thousands of years of educational practice that has existed on these lands that we have much to learn from. I invite everyone who's here, wherever you are, to acknowledge the lands you might be joining us from in the chat. On to the next slide, please, Joe. Student equity is near and dear to all of us. We've all got our experiences of it. Something you may not know about me is I am not a first in family student because I had the experience of watching my mum enroll in uni, drop out, and then go back to working at Kmart. It's very dear to me, and one of my career highlights has actually been working on an equity program on the very unit that caused mum to quit uni. I care a lot about equity. CRADLE cares a lot about it. And my very dear colleagues care a lot and have really been contributing to a lot of national debate that's been going on in Australia and elsewhere. It's in the spotlight here in Australia because of the Accord. And there's a lot of good ideas circulating around. But the extent to which those good ideas are built on a robust understanding of equity students' actual experiences is unclear to me. And that's why I'm so delighted to be joined by three dear current and former CRADLE colleagues. Dr. Joanna Tai, Senior Research Fellow at CRADLE, very, very soon to be Associate Professor in a matter of mere weeks. Dr. Nicole Crawford, who is Senior Research Fellow with us as well, working on particular projects at CRADLE, including this one. And our dear former colleague, Professor Rola Ajawi, who used to be professor with us, but she's now at the University of British Columbia, where she's a scientist in the Centre for Health Education Scholarship, professor in the Department of Surgery in the Faculty of Medicine. Now, before I hand over to Joe, who's going to sort of drive the seminar on their end, I have a few little bits of housekeeping. Firstly, they're going to speak for about 45 minutes, followed by questions until the hour, and then we'll do a formal close. And then if there's interest, we'll have up to half an hour more of Q&A. It's our usual sort of CRADLE webinar setup. This session is being recorded. Because some of the data is still under review, the presentation recording is going to be shared, but not the slides. So pay close attention or watch the video later. The chat won't be shared, though if there's some useful links in there, we sometimes pull those out and share it. Jack's going to be in there monitoring the chat. So the number one thing Jack's going to be monitoring for is people who've put questions in the chat, because that's not where they go. Questions go in the Q&A. So you'll see there's a Q&A button there. You can click it, you can type your questions in, and really importantly, you can upvote questions. When we go to Q&A, we're going to see those ones with the most votes, and we're going to prioritize those ones. Now, without any further ado, I'm so excited to hand over and listen to the team. Thank you so much, Joe.
Thanks, Phil. And so to begin, I'd like to also share that while myself, Nicole and Rola are presenting today, the project team actually involves a few more people, including Professor Margaret Bierman, Dr. Matt Brett, Professor Molly Dollinger and Elsie Meehan. And we would also like to acknowledge the support of Deakin and Deakin's allocation of the HEP funding, who supported this project and actually made it possible. We'd also like to acknowledge very much the contributions of the 35 student participants who were part of this project for their generosity, their honesty and their time across the project. And there were also a range of people who helped us along the way, advised us, were part of the project team and moved in and out for various reasons. So while there were only 3 of us talking today, there was actually a much larger group of people that made this project actually happen. So the seminar is going to take place in about 4 parts. I'll take you through the context and the background relating to the topic. Nicole will talk about the research approach and methods in detail to really give you a deep understanding of how we've come to what we've come to. Rolla will present one set of findings from the project using that metaphor of the house of cards. And then I'll come back in to share a little bit of a happy story, stories of success. And then we'll move towards team reflections, what we've learnt from doing this project and what we hope to do in the future and what's happening next. So Phil already mentioned the university's accord and perhaps those broader, more long-standing expectations for what higher education should do in Australia, about how we expect university to offer an opportunity for people to grow and develop in the ways that they want to, and to achieve better futures for themselves and those around them. However, we do also know that students experience multiple challenges within and beyond that university environment. And these things beyond the university environment actually really impact on what happens for them at university. So the cost of living, pressures which are increasing, housing supply shortages, and increasing and ubiquitous mental health concerns. So these things might all impact on how students experience higher education. What we do in the university is something that doesn't stop. The solutions are not things where we can just implement something and it just works by itself. We need to continue structuring our teaching and learning environments in a way that supports students to do what they want to do and to support their needs. And within increasingly large institutions, doing this work and tailoring what happens is not an easy sort of thing to do. There are many complex considerations that we need to take into account when we're making decisions about what happens, how curriculum works, how the structures around curriculum works, what kinds of supports, policies and systems exist to ensure that students can engage effectively in their learning. And so this was something that really interested us, how we can support students to have agency in their place of study when we also know that there are things that are very much outside of our control in terms of student life circumstances. So what things can we actually control, therefore, within the institution? And how and where can we make improvements, and particularly thinking about supporting equity group students? So I mentioned that long-standing expectation around education offering a fair chance for all, and that's something that Jason Clare has said repeatedly in the past couple of years. And indeed, our efforts to widen participation, which have been occurring for a long time now, over 30 years, have seen, recent increases in some groups of students. So in the period from 2017 to 2023, students with disability and First Nations students' participation did increase. But all the other groups have remained fairly stable over this time. However, when we get to that other end, that completion rates, we can see that they're not comparable at either 9 years, which offers you the broadest opportunity to complete at a part-time enrolment level, and accounting for longer degrees and shorter degrees. That 9-year completion rate for students with a disability, First Nation students, first in family and non-English speaking backgrounds are generally not on par with the average undergraduate domestic student. And our data, they've changed a couple of these categories, and the calculations might not always look the same. So in that 6-year completion graph on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see that the low socioeconomic status and regional, rural, remote data pops up with that starting date. of 2015, you can kind of see that actually, things are not great. And we must therefore think, well, there's something happening between the students coming in and what happens to them during university to result in these completion rates being not comparable. And so, we're definitely not the first group of people to do work in this place. We are building upon many great giants within the practice, the policy space, leadership across many different types of topics. There are many different centres that have been studying things in this field for a very long time. And you can see this very complex diagram that there are many different people in this space who are well known for their work. Ella Kahu and Karen Nelson, for instance, in their work around student engagement. Sarah O'Shea, looking at first in family. Others with transition pedagogy, student equity, student wellbeing, enabling education, student success. And so that's just within Australia. We also know across the higher education policy sector, there have been many people who have been writing for a long time and reviewing higher education to try and support an improved environment for equity group students. And this kind of also reflects worldwide movements around supporting students from a great diverse range of backgrounds to actually come into higher education and benefit from it. In terms of empirical studies, we know that many of these actually already exist, and there have been quantitative studies which have used descriptive statistics and correlations to confirm that indeed there are some kinds of relationships between particular categories and labels for students and their outcomes. Mixed methods and qualitative studies also have explored and described the experiences of students from equity and equity-like backgrounds, and they've done this across many different key points in the student journey, from transition into higher education to what participation and engagement with higher education looks like, and some work on assessment. I guess where we kind of saw the gap was really that much of the work was cross-sectional, which means that it doesn't really offer us that rich understanding, not just of what happens at one point in time, but of how student journeys evolve and what things sequence together to combine towards the outcomes we are seeing for students. And we really wanted to take a very sort of deep approach to looking carefully at the nuance of student stories rather than trying to sort of generalize and think that all students are the same. We were really interested in those unique journeys and how we might see across the journeys what patterns evolve, and particularly how we could support students so to navigate their experiences. So now I'm going to pass over to Nicole to take you through the research approach and methods.
Thank you, Jo, and hello, everyone. So our aim was to understand the day-to-day lives of students from equity and diverse backgrounds. And our overarching research question we have here in the second dot point, and that is, how do students negotiate their learning over one trimester of study? We've got 4 sub-research questions. The first, how do students exercise their agency as they navigate the curricular, co-curricular, extracurricular components of their learning journey? The second, what are the places, people and processes that support wellbeing and belonging during a trimester of study? The third, how do students seek help, support and feedback, and who do they seek it from? And the fourth, how do all of these concepts, agency, belonging and support, interplay through time? So we undertook a longitudinal qualitative research with 35 students through a series of 4 interviews. And our work is informed by a constructionist epistemology. In our team, we have various perspectives as researchers, educators, equity practitioners and policymakers in higher ed, and we make meanings of the data with an interplay between our various perspectives. Next, please, Jo. So I just want to provide a bit of background around some terminology. Firstly, a little bit of history around equity groups. So in the 1990 Australian Government report, A Fair Chance for All, a national framework articulated the aim of achieving equity in higher education, and that is to ensure that the benefits of higher education are within everyone's reach. 6 equity groups were identified with the intention of increasing their representation in higher education. More than 30 years later, these groups are still a key focus, and they're listed here on the left-hand side of the slide: students from non-English speaking backgrounds, students with disability, women in non-traditional areas, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, students from low socioeconomic status areas, students from regional and remote areas. Over many years, issues with the 6 groups have been discussed. For example, definitions and labels have been altered. There's also been much discussion around which groups of students are missing or neglected. And some other groups I've got in the box there, and referring to them as equity-like, they include students who are first in their family to attend uni, students who are carers, mature age students, students from refugee backgrounds, students who identify as LGBTIQ+, students who are veterans, and there are many more that can be included here. Our project is HEP funded, so I just wanted to explain a little bit about that. HEP is the Australian Government Equity Funding. It stands for the Higher Education Participation and Partnerships Program. Universities receive different amounts of HEP funding. Prior to 2021, the aim of HEP funding was to support students from low SES areas. Since 2021, HEP funding has been adjusted to support 3 of the 6 groups: students from low SES, Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander students, and students from regional and remote areas. And just a little side note, currently there's uncertainty with the implications of the Australian Universities Accord and what's going to happen with HEP beyond next year. So a little question, what do we make of equity groups? Well, that could be a whole seminar in itself and something we've discussed a lot over the last couple of years, but we just want to say at the outset that we are acutely aware of the pros and cons of labels and categories. And I also acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues, for example, Bronwyn Fredericks and Peter Anderson and many more, who question labelling Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students as an equity group. They are the First Peoples and have a human right to education. Peter, for example, argues for focusing on rights. We are using the term equity because it's used in higher ed in Australia, but we acknowledge there are numerous other terms. A few are listed in the box on the top right-hand side of the slide, and some of those are also contested. So while we pay attention to the groups in terms of the funding and therefore recruitment of students for the research, we see it as a bit of an anchor point. Data about equity groups can provide national pictures that Jo showed earlier and institutional pictures. Of course, it doesn't show everything, and we understand that equity groups are not homogenous, also that students arrive at university with multiple intersecting identities and life circumstances and strengths, and are part of our society with structures and histories that create privilege for some and disadvantage for others. We're interested in the individual students' experiences, not to blame them or fix individual students, but to think about what we do and what we can improve in universities. And another term to touch on is success. So it's often defined around, passing or failing or university success and attainment rates, but we acknowledge that success means many different things to different students individually, in their friendship groups, in their families and their communities. Next, please, Jo. So onto our participant recruitment. This project was initially a 1-year project to be undertaken last year in 2023. So we started out early last year working on the research protocol and the ethics application, and that was a higher than low risk ethics app. At that time, we were also working on another part of the larger project, having conversations with HEP project staff. Institutional HEP funding required us to recruit participants from the 3 HEP categories: low SES, regional, rural, remote, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. We had this quite elaborate recruitment strategy via the many HEP-funded projects at Deakin and via the Naikiri Institute. We planned a staged approach so that we wouldn't recruit from all the different programs and then be over-recruiting. And we had several stages up our sleeves in case we needed them, because we needed to conduct the data collection in trimester 2, and that meant we needed to act pretty quickly as soon as we got ethics approval. In our ethics app, we aimed for recruiting 30 to 40 students, assuming there would be a drop-off given the longitudinal nature of the research. It's quite a big ask of students to participate in 3 interviews in 1 trimester. As it turned out, there was a lot of interest after our first planned stage of recruitment. The inclusion criteria were current undergrad students who were 18 years of age or older and who identified with 1 or more of the identities or backgrounds in the list at the bottom there, the 3 HEP categories: regional, rural, remote, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and low SES. And we also included a 4th criterion: disability, health and or mental health condition. Next, please, Jo. So after getting ethics approval and recruiting student participants, we followed the 30-odd students through trimester 2 last year, interviewing them 3 times at the beginning, the middle and the end of trimester to explore our research questions and also students' experiences of change and stability through time. So to start with, let's just have a look at the first 3 rounds of interviews. In the diagram, you can see 35 students started out being involved in an interview. Of the 35, 31 continued and participated in a second interview, which was in the middle of trimester 2. Of the 31, 30 continued and were involved in a 3rd interview. We were really pretty happy with this number of students continuing in the project. The reasons why a few discontinued were because they withdrew from their course. 1 student was in hospital, another student had a child in hospital. So those types of reasons. Students received a $50 gift voucher per interview as a thank you and to acknowledge their time and efforts. Due to the student data and the retention of the participants, at the end of last year, we were keen to continue by following up with the students this year during trimester 1. So we got ethics approval to do so. And 27 students participated. We weren't able to get in touch with all students. Some may have withdrawn or finished and had, stopped checking their university email. The beauty of conducting the 4th interviews is that 11 had actually finished, so we could explore their transition out experience. Another 10 were approaching the end of their course, so they were starting to think about grad positions and how to get into things like honours in psychology or, what's next for them. And it's also interesting to continue with the remaining 6 who are still doing their course and to see how they were going. The interviews were mostly conducted online, a few over the phone. If a student was, say, on campus and, the laptop had run out of charge, they might opt for chatting on the phone. Or if they were off, doing some exercise, going for a walk and wanted to use that time during the interview to go for a walk, then they would do it on the phone as well. They were also offered to do face-to-face walking interviews in the 2nd round. And that was really fun for me. Students showed me places on campus where they studied or hung out. So we have a total of 123 in-depth interviews. This is a lot of qualitative data and there are many ways for us to explore it. Next, please, Jo. So on this slide, there's just a bit of info about the participants. Nearly 3/4 reported being from regional, rural or remote area. 42.9% reported being from a low SES area and 22.9% weren't sure. Just over half reported having a disability, health or mental health condition. 1 participant identified as being of Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander origin. A large majority of the participants were women. This is not unusual in higher ed research and especially in student equity research, particularly in regional and remote cohorts. To start with, the numbers of women studying are higher in regional and remote areas, and they increase with rurality. The participant group is diverse in terms of when students started studying, straight after school or a few or many years later, their study mode, whether they were on campus or online, their study type, whether they were part-time, full-time, their course, their year level, and also there's diversity in their life circumstances, such as working, parenting and caring. And I just want to add one more point about the participants. Many had never been involved in any research before or in any extracurricular programs or in any student staff partnerships. partnership programs. Some had, but the majority had not. Next, please, Jo. So the qualitative data analysis, started out becoming, immersing ourselves in the data, becoming familiar, reading transcripts, developing an initial coding framework after the team read and discussed a set of transcripts. After redrafting the coding framework, team members were assigned transcripts to code. Just a few of the high-level themes, or what we'll call big buckets, were life and study, moments of crisis, assessment experiences, and support structures. And then these big buckets were then analysed further. Depending on our preliminary findings, we then conducted more specific analysis on the different high-level themes. So, for example, we conducted analysis on some of the data where there was a bit of an intersection between the moments of crisis bucket and life and study using metaphor. And now I'll hand over to Rolla, who will tell you more about that analysis.
Thank you, Nicole and Jo. So I get the fun part of kind of sharing with you some of the findings that have come out of the student data. Just remembering that this is really a snapshot of all the experiences that they had and that we were able to capture for the purposes of this talk. So as Nicole mentioned, as we were looking at the data and thinking about it, we kind of get going around in circles around different metaphors. And when we were talking about juggling, we were talking about a variety, but the one that we sort of kept coming back to is this idea of the house of cards, which refers to a precarious, unstable, or fragile situation. So when something's precariously balanced, but easily brought tumbling down, sometimes by the smallest perturbation. And so we went back to the data and we looked at each student as a case in themselves and kind of went, what are the can we see different stages of this in their journey across the one trimester? And so what we are posing with this metaphor is we liken that student participation, students from equity background and historically underrepresented groups, participation in higher ed to a house of cards. The students learn to work with the cards that they're dealt with, and a lot of their agentic field is around scheduling and ordering and a lot of invisible work, which I'm going to show you in a bit. And then, life happens. Something happens and there's a wobble, and this really quickly can lead to a partial or complete collapse. And in the aftermath, students try to rebuild. So I'm going to now walk you through some student data for each one of those stages. Alice, thank you. Actually, we invite you to think critically about this metaphor and whether it does work or doesn't, and whether it helps us reframe and think about the student participation differently. Thanks, Jo. So let's start with the first bit, building the house of cards. So like I said here, there's two entailments of this metaphor. The first is how students needing to work with the cards that they're dealt. And the second is how they go about ordering these cards in order to try and build a foundation from which that they can do their study, their life, their work, and try and work through all of those things. I'm going to start with a quote here from Natasha. Natasha is a single mum, lives in a regional area. She works full-time and studies online. She says, I have a 16-year-old son. I'm a single parent trying to work full-time, parent my teenager, fit in 100 hours of logbook driving for my son and part-time study as well. It's all pretty full on. And so imagine trying to fit all of that in, right, in a limited amount of time. And so what they're doing is a lot of ordering and scheduling of their time. And we really see that with Ben here, who's working full-time and studying online. And his routine is going to bed at 10 p.m., waking up at 4 a.m., starting to write assignments at 4, going to work, full-time work, 4 subjects or units of study, 6 hours of sleep every night for the last, however, maybe since we last met. This might ring true for you as well. I have no doubt many of the academics, faculty and staff and professional staff could be also keeping these kind of schedules. They might be sustainable for a short time, but not for a very long time. And then finally, Jilly also says, so Jilly is a mum. She works full-time and studies online. A lot of my study happens at nighttime. I'll try and do 4 or 5 hour blocks after the child's in bed. I sleep for about 4 or 5 hours, get up and do it all again the next day. Then I'll try and work. I'll work weekends, which is handy. So each of these students had a different tight schedule, but really that was common. The thing about the lack of give in their schedules and how a bit like a Tetris game. Now I'm mixing my metaphors completely, but a bit like a Tetris game where they're kind of trying to fit the different parts, including caring for kids, working, caring for others, studying, sleeping, eating, all of that. Thanks, Joe. So then life happens, like I said, and this looked different for each of the students. So there's multiple responsibilities, unanticipated demands, and when things were so tightly structured, you could see the vulnerability and the foundation started to wobble. So, for example, Bree got a promotion at work, which meant she had more responsibility at work, had to work longer hours. Carrie Ann had to care for one of her grandparents because the other grandparent had a stroke. And as this happened, the assignments kept piling up. The first quote there from Charlotte at the end of, who lives rural, studies online, at the end of last trimester, actually around exam time, my mum got sick. I'm trying to look after her as much as I can. My dad's working, he's busy. So I'm sort of cooking the meals, cleaning, I'm doing all the things because everybody's sort of out of the house during the day. These are unanticipated, you know, things kind of happen. And the students really talked about the anguish of trying to keep on top of things while things piled up. Aisha said, in trying to do this, I was focusing on my assignments rather than the actual content of the units. So that's a big thing that I noticed, is that rather than being able to juggle both like I should be doing, I have to choose one. Now, here, there's a number of things going on, literally, for the student, but also we could think about how potentially the assessment isn't really aligned to the course content. So potentially the student is thinking, I have to do this assignment, which takes me away from the weekly learning and teaching. But really what's also happening for some of these students is that they have multiple units. So when there's an assignment due for one unit, they focus on that one. They spend a lot of time trying to do the assignment. The learning and teaching content for the other unit falls behind. Now, given all the scheduling and ordering and limited time that they had when they fell behind on the other unit, it was really hard to then catch up with that one. So it's kind of like that sort of thing is happening, and we see that a bit in Kelsey's quote there at the bottom. The compounding effect of this slow falling behind, the day-to-day decisions of I might need to miss a lecture here, or I need to focus on this assignment, so I won't do that piece of work. And then so Kelsey says, because I was often working 1 week behind or sometimes 2 weeks behind on the weekly content, I found attending the online sessions, I was too far behind for what they were looking at in terms of the week's content. So if I asked the questions that I had now, it was irrelevant. And so this stopped some students from asking questions because they thought, well, I'm 2 weeks behind. Maybe when I catch up, the answer will be in that content somewhere, right? So can you see how this amplifies? The more you fall behind, the less you engage with the synchronous stuff, the less learning opportunities you have, the more you fall behind, and this is what we refer to as what others have referred to as an amplification cascade. Next slide, thanks, Joe. Now we're on to stage 3, which is where there's a lot of increased stress and pressure as these students fall further behind. We have a quote here from Aisha, who says, I feel like it's just building up inside me and I'm just having to pull through until I'm done. At the same time, sometimes I'm like, if I have one more stress in my life right now, I will break. I will probably break down from the stress. It's just overwhelming. Alana says, in her story, told us she had physical disability, lives rurally, is studying online, and is a mother of 2 students. She refers to this thing I was mentioning about. I had a final essay to do and I had fallen behind in the readings. So I pretty much backed myself into a corner where I had to do an essay on one particular book. I couldn't make myself think. I can't do what they want me to do. I don't understand. I ended up submitting something that wasn't finished, that I was completely unhappy with. What I find interesting in this quote is the attribution to herself as the problem, to the fault being she backed herself into a corner. And I can't do what they want me to do. I don't understand. You can imagine as this pressure and stress kind of builds up, it would affect your cognitive ability to engage with materials deeply. And also if you're running out of time and you're already chock-a-block, if you like, in that time, then there's very little leeway for you. The foundations are quite wobbly, so there's little leeway to kind of stock them up again. Stock is probably the wrong word, but never mind. And you know, some of the things that happened to the students was really quite devastating. So Kelsey said her daughter's dad wouldn't let her see her daughter. It was just under a month that I didn't get to see her. I was in bed depressed. When I did eventually get back into study, I was 5 or 6 weeks behind. I wasn't interested. I just thought, I'm going to fail. What's the point of putting in any effort? And so while Alana did actually pass that particular assessment, Kelsey didn't. And what we end up doing, if these students kind of fail or realize that they're going to fail after census date, they get penalized. They get penalized for having something happen, like her having, you know, this incident happen where she wasn't allowed to see her daughter, had to go to court with her partner and sort it out in this depression. And then we say, well, you've got to pay for the unit of study and then repeat it again next year. So in some ways, we end up kind of penalizing the students. And if we think about the 35 students that we had in this study, 6 students failed their units, 2 intermitted to manage stress and health conditions, 3 withdrew late due to limited time, and 2 wondered about quitting their course. We didn't go out seeking to recruit high-risk students. These were students who fit one of the HEP equity categories. And so what we see here is how some of the day-to-day decisions were really not really decisions. They have such little agency in this. And then the falling behind little by little, or the critical incidents like these that kind of end up shaking things when they're already a bit precarious. One thing to say here is that, you know, you might be thinking, well, did many of them access services? And we do have a full suite of services at Deakin. I think many of them knew about potential services, but these would have taken more time to reach out to. And so not many did use them. The Disability Resource Centre was one, and assessment extensions were also reached out to. But in general, I would say no, not many students talked about reaching out to support services. Next slide, Jo, thank you. So what happened in the aftermath? There was a lot of self-blame and emotional toll, lots of fury, anger, negative effects on mental health. Madeline says, I won't look back at my time at uni being happy about the memories I've made. I'll look back at it as being the most stressful event of my life and wondering why I put myself through it. I want a career, but I don't know if it's worth enduring any more of this anxiety and stress and helplessness that I've felt from completing this degree. And Natasha says, it was very disappointing, obviously, because my work is paying for my degree now. For me to retake that subject, I have to pay for it myself. There's that financial aspect for me as well. Again, as a single parent, it's $1,600 that I don't have. It was like the academic failure, the financial failure, then just you as an individual, you feel like you haven't done enough. Again, here I want to point out how students blame themselves for something that is more structural in nature. Our degrees aren't designed with these students in mind. There's very little flexibility in a very short period of time over 10 weeks of a trimester. Now, I realize that you can, with good planning and support and mentorship throughout a degree, to plan out what is reasonable allocation to take alongside the other commitments you have in your life, but also yes and no, because we saw some things that cropped up that would-be students weren't expecting at all. So yeah, so but you know, in saying all of this, many just put one foot in front of the other again and just kept on going, like Kelsey did here. Back to uni, I know I can do it, and I just had that support around me to go, just forget that it happened, or use it as a learning moment, or just don't let that happen again. And here you see really how strong and driven these students are despite the circumstances. Next slide, Joe. So I'm going to finish off on this slide and kind of say something about how we kind of think about this. The cohort of students were mostly, or a lot of them were working, had some caring responsibilities. Some had studying online. And so those are the students that, these aren't the entire cohort, but those are some of the students that we're designing our degrees for. Now, all of the students are, whether they're from equity backgrounds or not, have their own form of house of cards. Many can be well equipped with economic, social, and cultural resources. But for these students, their houses weren't so well appointed, making the entire structure vulnerable to external shocks or circumstances when students' ability to prop up the structure reached its limits. And so while wobbles are part and parcel of every human life, these can have disproportionate impacts if the house is already on shaky grounds. So relatively small misses by students can contribute to collapse as they amplify over the course of a trimester. And so many do succeed despite these flimsy foundations, but to some extent at the risk of some of their mental health, emotional health, and potentially financial health. So I guess what I want you to reflect on is how useful is the house of cards metaphor. Thanks, Jo.
Thanks, Rolla. And so I know this is perhaps a little bit of a sort of sad point, thinking about this metaphor, which maybe helps to explain helps us make sense of how things happen. But we wanted to come to a little bit more of a happy ending. And so I wanted to just share with you very briefly another set of findings, stories of success. And we did find success throughout student stories. It wasn't just at a single point. And here we're really coming to those 4th interviews conducted this year in trimester 1, when we got students to look back at what they were doing and perhaps if they'd graduated, what happened afterwards. And so success for students happened in different ways. And I think this is something that has already been demonstrated in the literature and others' research as well, that it's not just one thing, and we shouldn't just be thinking about the metrics, the statistics at the end of the day. We need to think about what it means for individual students and how they see success. So there were things around just being at university, that transition to school, relocation from school to uni, a relocation, getting used to a new environment, and also supporting others at university and making friends. A lot of students talked about how they overcame obstacles and saw this as success, continuing in difficult circumstances, demonstrating their persistence after failure, in a task or a unit. As Rolla mentioned, some students intermitted and some came back, and they found that really, they saw that as, I can do this, and I am being successful by being here. Of course, they talked about things to do with learning, such as understanding concepts or tasks, that aha moment when they got something, engaging with lecturers and peers, and being on top of things, that ordering, that scheduling, the organisation to be successful was all part of that. There was a lot in relation to assessment around submitting things on time, passing, getting good marks, and particularly that success in group assessment. When group assessment went well, they were particularly chuffed, as I'm sure we all are. In those stories where we caught up with students and they'd graduated, those next steps, finishing the course, graduating, attending graduation, moving on to the next step, so getting a grad job or enrolling in an honours programs, these were all things that students saw as part of their success. And so just to share a little bit more of a couple of stories. Now, you did hear a little bit about Kelsey already in Roller's House of Cards. After Kelsey finished her degree, she now works full-time as a qualified engineer. She was previously working there 4 days a week in her job, but they said, look, you kind of need to get the degree to progress. And so she has indeed done that. But within her local community, she's also been approached by 2 companies to be poached. And so she sees that as this great, she's been showered with opportunities, which has been great. And her family and colleagues were also really sort of proud of what she did. She says, it was a long time coming. I did it part-time. I still did it while working. And family are proud. My partner was blown away, and he wishes he could have had that opportunity. And I guess part of me persevered through it was his support. But then she also didn't want to take for granted that opportunity. And she said, yeah, even work was pretty excited about her graduating and getting that degree. And of course, she also had those more traditional ideas of success for her, that distinction, average overall. She's pretty happy. She acknowledged that her standards had dropped at one point because of her life circumstances, and she was keen to just pass and finish it. But she did also have that goal, that motivation of getting high grades. So it was a big high five for her to get that in the end. Amanthi was also another student who had a very complex life. She was caring for family. She had responsibilities within her community. And so for her, things were a little bit incremental. She reported some little successes along the way around making progress, being on top of an assignment. For her, self-care was also really important, ensuring that she cared for herself. Because the wheels had fallen off for her in a previous attempt at university when she wasn't taking care of herself and making sure that she was well before she could engage in university. And so then she talks about her graduation. I think this time around, I tried really hard with this degree, graduated with distinction, which I can't believe I actually got. And so she really, basked in that moment of success. She got the professional photos. She had that great experience at graduation, that acknowledgement of her success. And then she also talks a bit about her employment after graduation. She started at her new job, and she was working there, and then she actually got a proper grad job. And so she's really linked what happened at university to her success beyond. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a window into some of the happy things that happened for these students as well. And I guess we wanted to leave you with some of our reflections of doing this work. We recognise, thinking right back to that complex slide at the start of all the work that has come before, some of the findings haven't been particularly groundbreakingly new in what they contain, but we feel that the longitudinal qualitative nature of this work showed us how important it was to actually do it this way rather than continue to try and get snapshots, and to stay with the students and really understand those stories and for what it means for students, and to really go with them around those wicked problems. We feel stuck for solutions in this in this space, and I guess that we haven't really moved beyond doing the same kinds of things indicates that we're kind of stuck. So, it's a reflection for us. How do we move beyond this point? What other perspectives or other ways of thinking about what's happening here for these students? How can we gain insights that are helpful? And I think one part of doing this deep qualitative work also reinforces that limitation of those quantitative approaches, which kind of take all students as a whole and lumps them together in categories. So there's a question here then about, well, if we're not using those metrics, how can we research impact in education and what makes a difference for particular groups of students? And so, practically, many of our recommendations out of the work we've done aren't new. It doesn't mean they're not important. It reinforces the importance of continuing to support students in contemporary learning and teaching situations. We do get a sense, though, that we need better loops, feedback loops, to make sure that things are continuously improving, that we can tweak things and not just say, well, we're just doing the best we can. We should always be thinking about how can we do it differently if it's going to make a difference for our students. And we also found by talking to these students and developing relationships with the students across time, there were reciprocal benefits of being involved in the research for us in learning and being able to really engage with students in that way, which we don't often get an opportunity to. But also the participants let us know that they also really enjoyed being part of the work and giving back. And for some, they mentioned even that this was the first time they had an opportunity to have a real conversation or series of conversations with someone at the university. And so we've got some quotes here on the right about some of our personal insights. I was really struck by how much agency you can have under very constrained circumstances. And it was about students responding in ways that made sense for them in their situations. We still, I guess, have some questions about, who are we positioning universities for? And this is the real challenge in higher education, to actually ensure that we have universities that are doing the things that students want university to do for them. And then that sort of deep connection that is needed between support services and teaching, and how we can balance what happens in those systems and how they twine together in a way that actually makes sense for what we're doing. So where to next? So far, what we've been doing is that we've been trying to translate this into practice through sharing findings at Deakin and beyond, and tailoring some of our analysis for particular teams and communities at Deakin, so we can actually implement some of the stuff that we're learning. We've also been writing research papers for journals, and the House of Cards paper is currently under review, so fingers crossed about getting that one out. What's coming next for us? And I guess we didn't want to make recommendations across the entirety of the world, because context is really important. And I think I noticed some comments in the chat before about, wow, it's great to see these students' experiences and trying to make sense, I guess, of this particular group of students. And I think we are fortunate at Deakin to have such a diverse range of students, and the fact that we are able to do this work with students with all these complexities in their lives. So I don't know if I don't want to say that Deakin students are like all students, or all students are like Deakin students, or even that all students at Deakin are like the students that we spoke to. But so that kind of bounds what we can recommend, or what I would like to recommend, to things about for us maybe, and things that might be of interest in the general abstraction of themes rather than specific points for practice. So we want to keep on working with Deakin teams on how we translate what we've learnt into what happens here. We're hoping to do a lot of more longitudinal analysis of students' experiences through time across the interviews. We also can see some really interesting cross-sectional analyses, maybe more focused on ideas and concepts and themes that come out of the data. So the transition out experience, their reflections on what I wish I'd done at university. And things like assessment, including group assessment, looking at that emotional impact of what happens, and also thinking more about connections and isolation and belonging. So I know we've taken a little bit longer than what we promised in terms of time to share this with you, but hopefully you found it helpful or useful, and look forward to all of your questions. And thanks, Nicole. I know Roller's put it in the chat, but thanks, Nicole, for putting together the amazing slides and everything else for the presentation, because she has been the driver of a lot of the work for this.
Wow. Thank you so much, Joe, Rolla, Nicole. An absolute joy to listen to this work after observing it for a few years. Heaps of positive messages in the chat. I know some people are going to be leaving us in a couple of minutes, so I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank everyone for coming along, thank the three of you for presenting a wonderful session, and wishing everyone a really great break. And we'll have more CRADLE seminars next year. So keep an eye on however it is you found us, probably an email from us or the CRADLE blog, and you'll hear about our next seminars. We've got till 3:30 my time here in Melbourne, so another half hour to really get into some questions. And there are a few in there. The first one is one that's been upvoted the most, so I'll get to it first, and it's from CRADLE co-director Dave Bowd. Dave says, what much of this points to is the limitations of current conventions about how courses should be structured. That is, around a student with no distractions who can devote all their life to their studies. What would a course that didn't use these assumptions and which accommodated the variations you have identified look like in contrast to the normal model? And I'm going to let either of you address this one.
I'm going to stop sharing the slides first so that we can all see each other a little bit better. What would a course look like that didn't use these assumptions? I guess the first thing, and Molly, one of our team members, has actually also led a paper on this issue of time. And I think time was this thing that didn't play out the same way for all students. And I think you might have got some hints of that through, being behind and how many weeks behind. And that feeling that time at the university runs in a very regimented fashion, for perhaps bureaucratic and organizational reasons, and to make, deadlines occur so that things can progress in a particular way. And yet we know people, in our study, I think, and through Dave's comment, time is experienced differently by different people for different reasons. And so I guess that's the first thing that comes to mind around what could we do differently. And yet at the same time, I know Deakin has had a small suite of Start Anytime courses where time is a different beast, and you can do the course as you want, submit your assessments as you want. And yet that coordinating the external motivator of having a deadline for submission is also kind of helpful. So between the everything is open and the strict regimentation, and I think particularly at Deakin, because we have trimesters, and the trimesters are, I think, 11 weeks long, it's perhaps a little bit shorter than other institutions. There's perhaps something in between that might work. And I think, Rolla, we've also had some conversations about, that the idea of that census date and when you can drop out, and also what happens if you get to the assessments and you're not doing well. How can you re-enroll, and perhaps with less financial penalty, or what is the opportunity to take the assessment again? And I know in Europe, for instance, there are countries where students can take the assessment as many times as they want. If they've studied the course, they can keep on trying the assessment until they pass. So that doesn't answer everything. Rolla, I don't know if you want to add.
Joe, I think time is really interesting. Like you mentioned the trimester thing, and yes, it compresses everything and makes it more tightly woven, but also what it does is it allows you potentially to take a load over 3 trimesters as opposed to 2. So you could, with consultation spread out your units over the year in a different way than having them concentrated in 2 semesters. So there's pros and cons, I suppose. I guess, you know, does someone sit down with the students and work out what's the situation for them before they start their degree, so that you can have a conversation about what are the real demands, how can they be kind of leveraged to work with your set of cards, and the two, so that kind of sense of having a mentor or a coach, or someone who knows you, who gets to know you over time. And maybe that's something we can't do for everyone, but maybe it's something that can be possible for students who are mostly online and who have these other kind of axes and other responsibilities, let's call it. I would say for me, there's 2 other things that are worth thinking about. One is this issue of work. I was struck by how many students were already working in the industries that they're studying from, and work was paying for them to essentially then make the next rung up to continue to, like in law, for example, they'd be working in a legal clinic, and once they did their degree, they had a job in the law firm. How do we capitalize on that work, on that work experience, you know, rather than assuming that every student starts with nothing and every subject starts with nothing? If we can maybe leverage that a bit better, maybe they don't have to do those artificial group work assignments or group work marks that are really meaningless. And actually what we found is some of our female highly responsible, conscientious students ended up holding the bucket for other students. So I think that's something that's worth having a conversation about. I think how we deal with failure and how we do that in a more relational, empathetic and thoughtful way. We did at Deakin well during the pandemic with a bit more flexibility in our assessment regimes, which were rolled back. That, you know, potentially might give a bit of give in the system. Yeah, I think those things. I had one other point, but it's disappeared, Dave. I'll put it in the chat if it comes back.
I might riff. Oh no, you go, Nicole.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of points to respond to Dave's question. So even just thinking within the current course structure, I would think about, and it comes back to time again, I would consider the importance of scheduling and timetabling. Like that came up a lot for students. So when are seminars offered? What time of day are they offered? If you're working, parenting, caring, those kinds of considerations are really important. Another around time, the time students have to get working on the content and assignments is around the availability of materials. So that came up for a few students who work full-time, and they wanted to get cracking on the materials in week 0, not week 1 or 2. They wanted to be able to access things immediately, and they could understand why, say, materials might be released weekly, but it didn't suit their needs. And yeah, just those 2 really. And I think they sort of link to Mary's question as well. If we're thinking about who are we serving, what are the needs of students who are parents, carers working, then timetabling and being able to get going on content pretty early are 2 points that came up a lot in the interviews.
Thanks so much. There's a little extra piece that I want to tack on to Dave's question, which is around sort of higher ed's pursuit of excellence and deep learning and all of that stuff versus, and this is pure perception from me, that sometimes people just actually have a legitimate reason for wanting to get through, be a strategic learner that we tend to denigrate so much. Interested in your thoughts or data on that.
I think, yeah, by necessity, a number of the students were extremely strategic, and you probably could have picked up on that. You know, the content was different from the assessment. I needed to focus on the assessment task. And that prioritization, I saw a comment in the chat much earlier on about how, you know, we assume these students aren't prioritizing and aren't being strategic when they don't do the things that we want them to do. But actually, they are being extremely strategic in the way that they're picking and choosing the things that would actually get them through. And I think that's a real tension within themselves around wanting to be a high achiever and wanting to perform really well and showing to the world that they can do it, and the realities of the choices they have to make within the work, the study, the caring, all of that. So yeah, I think a lot of the time, perhaps we are ungenerous in how we think about students and what they are doing. And perhaps we do need to be a little bit more generous about not assuming the worst and understanding that strategic is the closest we can get from someone, because they are already, you know, they're the duck. They're paddling very hard underwater and all we see is something gliding along the surface.
Bill, that's what we do. No, but I was joking before. I had every intention all the time of reading all the things or watching, you know, the lecture that was recorded last week that I registered for but couldn't go to. And our times are increasingly minutely scheduled as well. Like these sorts of things, there's a general acceleration of trying to fit too many things at once, and exacerbated by our ability to join all these things through Zoom and the rest of it. So I echo Joe around the empathy and really getting to know like what's going on here, and what is reasonable and what isn't, and maybe having those conversations around in the courses before making assumptions about why. But you know, you could argue that the way our courses are structured are really instrumental. You know, we've codified everything so that we've decided this is aligned to that, and this teaching and learning thing will get you to that outcome, and you have no choice in the assessment that you do. And, you know, like, yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah. I love that thing of actually getting to know them and having conversations around what are your actual goals, you know, where do you want to get to, rather than assuming everyone's off to become a Rhodes Scholar or something, you know, that's their deepest goal. I'm going to go to a question which I guess is kind of about the wobble. It's from Matthew Hillier. It says, wondering about your thoughts on the intersection with academic integrity. Life pressures can be a factor in choosing to take some shortcuts, e.g. failure means a liability for repeat $1,600 in fees and the time taken to do it that I don't have. A rational choice might be to pay $200 to someone else to do it. Thus, what can the university do to alleviate such pressure points?
Yeah, it's a concern. I think it's interesting. And I'm not going to speak from the data here. I'm going to speak from being still involved in various Facebook groups of universities and people saying, well, look, I've failed. What on earth can I do? Is this going to appear on my transcript? Like, it's a terrible situation. I'm going to have to retake this thing. How's this going to work? And hidden under hidden away in a little corner is apparently some information about, you know, you can ask for to have your fees sort of, you know, forgiven, kind of like, or a remittance made, even if you failed. Like there are special ways. If you jump through enough hoops and you can find the right justifications, the university can say, yeah, you can take it again and we won't charge you. And I think, I mean, that in itself, you know, just taking away the financial penalty might be enough to mitigate some of this stuff. And it turns out that tick box on the form already exists somewhere. It's just it's obviously not front and center, and students in what I've seen only find out about things like that through talking to other students, rather than it being front and center on a page or in a message saying, so you failed, what next? And so the support, and one thing we did see in the data was the kind of lack of support around that point of, so you failed, what's next? How can we move on from this point? How can we support you to move on? You know, problem solve your way through what's happening next. So I recognise Matthew's question probably comes a little bit before the failure point. It probably comes in that I'm squeezed and I'm looking for the best solution out of this situation. And I think then again, it is about knowing the students, developing those relationships so that they actually feel comfortable and know who to talk to if they're having trouble. And a number of the students were very surprised when their lecturers actually said, "Yeah, no problem, you can have an extension. Don't worry about it." Like they were genuinely surprised that they didn't have to submit reams of paperwork or write another whole essay about why they needed an extension. And so it's that thing about being generous, being empathetic, and having, I guess, being explicit about those structures that exist to support students at that point, and having the relationship in place that students feel comfortable in accessing those things.
I
Nicole,
think
yeah, Nicole, did you have more to say on this? I think you. No, we're good.
Roll as unmuted though.
And roll as unmuted.
I was going to say, Phil, you would have the best answer.
I'll give you a little thing. I think it's interesting if you look at the ways that some of these legitimate support options are hidden. Joe mentioned the ability to redo something without the financial penalty, that sort of thing could be hidden behind walls of bureaucracy. But a lot of these, other support services have very slick marketing teams that really link right into the fundamental needs of the students in that moment of stress. And I think we could potentially learn from how these illegitimate support services market and are so effective at getting people to do things. Mary's question has been addressed slightly, but I want to give Mary's question a chance. This is Mary McGovern. Parenting and caring is seemingly becoming a more standard characteristic of our students. How can we better support these students? I feel we need to advocate for their identification.
Yeah. I guess I made some comments. I made some, hints as to why labels and categorization might be problematic previously. That's not to say that recognizing that certain circumstances might have an impact on what happens at university isn't something good to do. And so, yeah, I think students' lives are becoming more complex. And I think I'm just looking down at Ria's question as well about changes in student population demographics might mean that those fortunate students who don't have to worry about equity challenges are probably going to become the minority. And indeed, I think that's one of the goals of the Accord, to make those students the minority. I think, yes, we need to think about all those different types of characteristics and how they might impact on individual students, and recognize the impact. But that doesn't mean that because they have a particular label means that they get treated in a particular way. So I'm advocating not for sort of labeling and stereotyping. I'm advocating for recognizing individual student circumstances appropriately. And so, yeah, I think generally there has been a move towards recognition of more and more different types of circumstances that might impact on study. But what these students need, particularly in terms of support, I don't know if we, like, beyond identification. So labeling is one thing, but what we actually do to support them is the next. Rolla, you've got something to say.
I just have a small story, Mary. In another study, not this one, a student said to me how much she felt like she belonged because she could take her kid to the library and there was a room with toys and that the child could play and she could study and do her work. So I don't know what the answer broadly is, but I think having spaces for people to maybe bring their children, or childcare, or but there is that research to be done on that.
I think Ria's question's been addressed to a degree. Is there anything else? It's sort of, as Joe sort of summarized, if we start as the assumption that everyone has, equity challenges, rather than viewing it as we have to adjust for you because you're some aberrant person.
And I think, Phil, that's so going to be like, I know Liz says something like, when the learning access plan system was developed, it was built for like apologies, Liz, if I completely butcher this, but like for 5% of students, that was the max, and we've well exceeded that. So that system of thou shalt do some, you have to jump through these hoops if you don't fit the normal that we've dictated in order to get some sort of change in your course to make it fit to your circumstances. That system is already creaky and falling. Matt Brett talks about why doesn't every student have a learning access plan that kind of talks about like what are the things that you need to help you succeed in this program, and that is revisited on a regular basis. Now 60,000 students doing that is quite an ask, but the numbers, the way we're doing things kind of might need to be rethought, and I think that's the move towards the inclusive curriculum, inclusive assessment. If you can front end some of that flexibility and choice, and that's what Zoom does to some extent. It has allowed the asynchronous stuff, it has allowed that, but it changes the nature of the engagement. But it'll all keep us in a job for a long time.
And we have our last question, which is from Fu. I'm interested to know if/how these findings differ for other students who have known scenarios coming up, like athletes or students with cultural obligations. You mentioned students with disabilities, First Nations students, carers, those with mental ill health, and those who have unexpected scenarios topple the house. But yeah, what about other people?
Yeah, we did have students in the study with cultural obligations, so thanks, Fu. That's absolutely relevant. They were really interesting conversations. Actually, I'm thinking of the student, her pseudonym is Aisha, and she had community obligations around certain times of festivals, and they often clashed with assessment deadlines, and she didn't feel that she could actually be honest as to why she was asking for an extension by saying, I've got this religious festival. So yeah, this comes back to knowing who our students are in all of their diversity, and approaching it with universal design or inclusive practices in all levels, all areas of the university. It's really ongoing work. Back to Matt Brett's point, I think in our internal report, this is ongoing work to understand who are our students, who are we serving, and being inclusive for all students.
Thanks so much. I think that's a really nice place to leave here, being inclusive for all students. I want to thank Jo, Nicole, Rolla for an amazing session, and especially a really great in-depth Q&A session. There was an amazing conversation going on in the chat with some really great resources that I hope people got. I want to give a shout out to the neurodiversity paradigm paper that I think Jo put in there. It's an excellent paper, well worth a read. That's where we're going to leave the CRADLE Seminar Series for this year. Thank you all so much for coming along. We will have a program of seminars next year. You will hear about them in a similar way to how you heard about this one. A recording of this session will be available. The slides won't be shared, but the recording will be there, and it'll be up on the CRADLE YouTube as well. So if you want some holiday YouTube, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a fantastic break. Bye.